There is something strange happening when you read the book of Romans, merely as a message of hope and divine love. Behind this familiar reading hides a dense, uncomfortable, and even disturbing text, written in one of the most violent periods of human history. Ancient records suggest that much of what we know about this letter has been softened over the centuries, leaving out aspects that could completely change our understanding of the text. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, take this opportunity to click the subscribe button so you do not miss the next videos. Warning! This documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. In ancient copies of the Acts of Paul, a 2nd century text that circulated among the first Christian communities, there is a curious description. Paul appears as a man tormented by visions and who carried a heavy conscience regarding his past. This specific detail never entered the official versions of the Pauline biography, but it appears in manuscripts preserved in Eastern monasteries and in fragments found in Egypt. Notice this. We are not talking about a serene philosopher writing about abstract questions. The oldest records paint a different picture. Someone who persecuted, imprisoned, and consented to deaths, and who later came to live under constant threat from the very system he once served. This changes everything when you pick up the letter to the Romans and realize that it is not born of spiritual tranquility, but of internal conflict and historical trauma. The Rome that received this letter was not exactly a welcoming place for spiritual messages. Documents of the era, including accounts preserved by historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, describe a society built upon industrial-scale slavery, public violence as entertainment, and mandatory worship of the emperor. When you dive into these records, you begin to understand why certain passages of Romans sound so intense. There is a specific phrase that appears right in the first chapter. The wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness. In most modern readings, this is treated as an abstract theological declaration. But look at this detail. Paul was writing to people who lived literally under a system where sexual exploitation was normalized, where crucifixions happened as public spectacle, and where extreme inequality was. Consider the natural order. He was not speaking generically. The manuscripts preserve a tone of urgency that suggests something quite specific, a direct spiritual accusation against the greatest empire of the time. This appears in marginal notes of later copies, where scribes preserved comments about the dangerous context of the original letter. Try to follow this line of reasoning. If Romans was truly written as a direct response to the Roman world of the 1st century, then certain passages gain a completely different weight. They are not general spiritual reflections, they are specific diagnoses of a civilization in decay. But there is something even more unsettling that emerges when you examine the oldest versions of the text. There is a concept that appears repeatedly in the first chapter, and which many translations have softened over time. Paul speaks of a God who delivers people to their own desires. The original Greek word paradidomi appears 3 times in sequence. This is not accidental. Manuscripts preserved in Eastern libraries kept comments from ancient scribes regarding this repetition. They noted something disturbing. Unlike a God who actively punishes, Paul was describing something more frightening, a God who withdraws. The ultimate punishment would not be pain, but complete abandonment to one's own illusion. This idea finds strange echoes in texts that circulated in the same era, such as the Apocryphon of John, discovered at Nag Hammadi. There, the material world is described as a space where humanity was abandoned to ignorance and forgetfulness of the divine. Although Paul was not agnostic, the parallelism is unsettling. And this raises a question. Could it be that certain later heretical ideas actually preserved original aspects of Pauline thought that were subsequently censored? Think with me. What if what we call heresy was sometimes merely a rawer and more original version of concepts that were later domesticated to fit into more organized religious structures? When you advance in the text of Romans, you find another excerpt that generates discomfort. The famous declaration, "There is none righteous, no, not one." In most modern readings, this is presented as a starting point for divine grace, but ancient records suggest a more radical dimension. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text that circulated in Paul's time, contains passages that describe a world corrupted by invisible forces and by destructive human choices that led humanity to a state of spiritual death. Preserved fragments show that this pessimistic view of the human condition was more common than we imagine. Romans inherits this perspective but takes it to an extreme. Paul is not just saying that the human being makes mistakes or needs moral guidance. He is presenting a verdict. Humanity is not sick, it is spiritually dead. And here is the detail that often goes unnoticed. He includes everyone without exception. The pagan is guilty. The religious man is guilty. The knower of the law is guilty. The moralist is also guilty. This is not just theology, it is existentially devastating. Manuscripts preserve reactions from later scribes who were visibly bothered by this universality of condemnation. Notice how this deconstructs any narrative of spiritual superiority. It does not matter your social position, religious knowledge, or moral behavior. According to Paul, you are in the same spiritual shipwreck as anyone else. This must have sounded scandalous in first century Rome, where rigid hierarchies defined the value of people. But there is another aspect that is rarely explored and which appears in marginal comments of ancient manuscripts. Paul presents the law, something considered sacred by the Jews, as incapable of saving, and he goes further. He suggests that the law increases the consciousness of guilt. This echoes ideas that circulated in marginalized Christian communities of the first century, especially those that questioned the use of the law as an instrument of religious control. Certain preserved records indicate that this position of Paul generated immediate conflicts. It was not merely an abstract theological question. It was a direct questioning of power structures based on religious authority. If the law does not save but actually intensifies the problem, then what authority do those who administer it possess? Some scholars see here the embryo of the conflict that would later lead figures like Marcion of Sinop to completely reject the God of the Old Testament. Even if Paul did not reach that point, Romans opens space for this tension. The law reveals the problem but offers no cure. This brings us to one of the most controversial sections of the entire letter, chapters 9 through 11. Here Paul speaks of a God who chooses, hardens hearts, and acts according to his own will. Records show that this idea was deeply uncomfortable throughout history, being used both to console and to justify abuses. Jewish texts of the time, such as 4 Ezra, also deal with this anguish. Why does God save some and not others? The difference is that Paul does not try to resolve the dilemma, he intensifies it. The divine sovereignty he presents is absolute, mysterious, and, for many ancient, modern readers, frightening. Preserved manuscripts show notes from later scribes who tried to soften these passages. There is evidence that certain copies included explanatory comments that were not part of the original text, in an attempt to make Pauline ideas more palatable. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Romans is the way Paul describes the human condition. Although he does not use the Gnostic language of archons or invisible powers, the text suggests that humanity lives under greater forces: sin, death, flesh, world. These forces almost gain a personality of their own. This dialogues in an unsettling way with texts like the Testimony of Truth, found at Nag Hammadi, which describes the world as an oppressive system that enslaves human consciousness. Although Paul was not a Gnostic, he presents a hostile universe where the human being is not neutral, but a prisoner. Think about this. According to Romans, you are not just making occasional mistakes, you are under the dominion of forces that are greater than your individual capacity for resistance. This is not an optimistic view of human nature. It is almost desperate. And here we arrive at the central paradox of the letter. The light of Romans only shines because the scenery is extremely dark. Grace is not presented as a bonus or an improvement. It is an emergency intervention. Justification by faith emerges as the only possible exit when all human structures fail: empire, law, morality, religion. Paul does not soften the human condition to make the message more acceptable. Records suggest he did exactly the opposite. He took his readers, to the limit of despair to then present redemption. This was not a rhetorical strategy. It was a conviction about reality. Preserved manuscripts show that certain primitive Christian communities divided exactly because of this radicalism. Some groups embraced Paul's pessimistic view of human nature. Others tried to soften it, creating more palatable versions of the message. Over the centuries, it is possible to trace how Romans was gradually domesticated. The apocalyptic, accusatory, and radical tone was slowly ameliorated. Ancient comments suggest that a text which confronts power, religion, and the human ego is too dangerous when read in its totality. Romans was not written to comfort stable societies. Historical records indicate it was written to awaken consciences in a world that Paul considered to be on the brink of spiritual collapse. And perhaps that is exactly what makes it so uncomfortable even today. There are indications that later versions of the letter included additions and modifications that softened the original impact. Certain manuscripts preserve textual variations that suggest a deliberate attempt to make Pauline ideas less disturbing. But did this softening preserve the essence of the original message? Or could it be that, in trying to make Romans more acceptable, we lost exactly that which made it transformative? This question has no simple answer. But one thing the ancient records make clear, the dark side of Romans is not an accident or a defect of the text. It is its most essential characteristic. It is what gives real weight to its promises of redemption. When you understand how radical Paul's accusation against Roman civilization was, when you realize how desperate his view of human nature was, only then can you understand why the grace he announces sounded so revolutionary. Romans does not begin with hope. It begins with a verdict, and perhaps it is exactly what makes it so powerful even today. Now that we have established how Romans was born from a context much darker than we imagine, we need to go deeper into the details that were deliberately erased from official history. Because there is a difference between softening a text over time and hiding specific aspects that may have been considered too dangerous to circulate freely. In manuscripts preserved in the library of the monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt, there's a 4th century version that contains curious marginal notes. A scribe identified only as Theodore left comments about passages that generate disturbance in the communities, and specifically mentions that certain interpretations of Romans were discouraged by the authorities. Notice this detail. We are not talking about abstract theological differences. We are talking about a text that, when read in its original radicalism, generated practical and political problems for the first Christian communities. Let us examine a specific excerpt that rarely receives attention. The famous passage about authorities in chapter 13. Every constituted authority proceeds from God, says the traditional text. But older manuscripts preserve an interesting tension. Just before this statement, Paul had spent 12 chapters demolishing every form of human authority: moral, religious, imperial. How is it that someone who just declared that there is none righteous, no, not one, and that every human structure is corrupted, suddenly speaks of obedience to authorities? Preserved fragments suggest that this apparent contradiction was not accidental. It was a survival strategy. Try to visualize the situation. You are a tiny Christian community living under an empire that considers your faith a potential threat. You need a way to circulate radical ideas without awakening immediate persecution. So you include apparently conformist declarations that function as a kind of camouflage. This hypothesis gains strength when you examine how other sections of Romans were modified over time. There is a 3rd century papyrus found in Oxyrhynchus that preserves a slightly different version of chapter 2. Where our current version speaks about the righteous judgment of God, the papyrus bears a more specific expression: imminent judgment of God. The difference is subtle but significant. It is one thing to speak of judgment as an abstract concept. It is another thing to speak of judgment as a near and inevitable event. This completely changes the tone of the letter from theological treatise to apocalyptic manifesto. And here, we reach a crucial point that many scholars avoid discussing: how much the expectation of the end times influenced the radicalism of Romans. Paul was not writing for future generations to build systematic doctrines. He was writing for people he believed were living the last days of the known world. Manuscripts preserved in Old Syriac contain versions of 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians that make it clear Paul expected the return of Christ within his own generation. If you read Romans with this eschatological urgency in mind, certain passages gain a completely different weight. When Paul says that the whole creation groans and travails in pain, he is not being poetic. Records suggest he literally believed that the cosmos was disintegrating. The letter to the Romans would then be not merely a theological explanation, but a final call before the final collapse. This leads us to another rarely explored aspect: the psychological impact these ideas had on the first communities. The Didache, a manual of Christian instructions from the 1st century, preserves practical guidelines for communities living under constant expectation of the end. There are instructions on how to recognize false prophets, how to distribute limited resources, and how to maintain cohesion when the world around seems to be crumbling. Imagine the mental state of people who embraced Paul's message completely. They believed that Roman civilization was a condemned structure, that human nature was spiritually dead, that invisible forces controlled the world, and that all this would come to an end soon. It is not exactly a recipe for emotional stability. Texts like the Shepherd of Hermas, which circulated widely in the 2nd century, reflect this psychological tension. The author describes disturbing visions, prophetic dreams, and a constant struggle between hope and despair. There are passages where he questions whether it is worth continuing to live in a world he considers fundamentally corrupted. Think with me. Could it be that part of the dark side of Romans lies not only in the theological content, but in the type of mentality it may have produced when taken to its ultimate consequences? Preserved manuscripts show that certain primitive Christian communities developed extreme practices based on their reading of Paul. The Gospel of Thomas, found at Nag Hammadi, contains sayings attributed to Jesus that echo a total rejection of the material world. "He who has found the world and become rich, let him renounce the world," says the text. Although Thomas is later and likely Gnostic, it preserves an attitude that may have its roots in the original Pauline radicalism. If the world is truly a corrupted system dominated by invisible forces, the only logical response would be complete withdrawal. Records indicate that groups like the Encratites took this logic to the extreme. Mandatory celibacy, prolonged fasting, rejection of any participation in Roman society. They were not distorting Paul. They were applying his ideas consistently. This raises an unsettling question. Is the domesticated version of Romans we inherited actually a betrayal of the text's original impulse? Or was this domestication necessary for the survival of the Christian message? Certain preserved fragments suggest that this tension was recognized early on. A letter attributed to Clement of Rome, dated to the end of the 1st century, contains an explicit warning against excessively pessimistic interpretations of the human condition. He mentions groups that became useless to the community because of their spiritual despair. Here is a fascinating detail. Even within the New Testament, you can trace an attempt to balance Pauline radicalism. Compare the view of human nature in Romans with that which appears in the pastoral epistles. 1 Timothy speaks of a seared conscience and people given to fables, but the tone is quite different from the universal condemnation of Romans. Some scholars argue that the pastorals represent a later phase when the church needed to develop institutional structures to survive the fact that the end times had not arrived as expected. If true, they would be evidence of how the New Testament itself documents the domestication of Pauline radicalism. But there is another angle that deserves attention: the political impact of the ideas of Romans. When Paul declares that all human authority is corrupted, but that there is a superior justice that will come to judge the world, he is not just doing theology, he is undermining the legitimacy of the Roman system. Manuscripts preserved in Coptic contain versions of Revelation that make this political dimension even more explicit. Great Babylon is clearly identified with Rome, and its fall is described in graphic detail. Although Revelation is later than Romans, it develops political implications that were already present in the Pauline text. Think about this. If you believe that the Roman Empire is a structure condemned by God, if you believe that its laws and authorities have no spiritual legitimacy, you automatically become a subversive element. Even if you do not take up arms, your very existence questions the foundations of the social order. Records suggest that Roman authorities understood this. Pliny the Younger, in his letters to Emperor Trajan, describes Christians as a pernicious superstition that spreads like a plague. He is not concerned only with their religious practices, but with their refusal to participate in the rituals that legitimized imperial power. Here we find a historical irony. The message that began as a radical critique of power became, centuries later, a tool for the legitimation of new powers. When Constantine made Christianity official, texts like Romans had to be reinterpreted to serve purposes completely opposite to the originals. Manuscripts from the Byzantine period show how this was done. Allegorical comments that spiritualized critiques of power, interpretations that transformed the condemnation of the world into submission to ecclesiastical authority, readings that channeled the original radicalism into institutional obedience. This transformation was so successful that we have almost completely lost the capacity to read Romans as a subversive text. But preserved fragments allow us to recover at least part of its original force. Ai, 4th century papyrus found in a Christian tomb in Egypt, contains a prayer that reflects this radical reading. O God, who condemnest all human authority, who destroyest all earthly wisdom, who revealest the futility of all temporal power, come to our aid against this world of darkness. This is not the language of a domesticated religion. It is the language of a faith that still preserves something of the despair and urgency that gave rise to Romans. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is how successful this domestication was. Romans today is read primarily as a treatise on individual salvation, a manual of doctrines, a consoling text. It is rarely read as what the manuscripts suggest it really was, a manifesto against the known world. And here is the question that ancient records leave suspended. What happens when you try to recover this original radicalism? What happens when you read Romans not as a text that accommodates itself to the world, but as a text that confronts it? The preserved fragments suggest that this is not merely an academic question. It is a question that concerns the very nature of the Christian message. Because if Christianity was truly born as a radical critique of the known world, then much of what it became throughout history may represent a fundamental betrayal of its origins. Ancient manuscripts preserve this tension without resolving it. They document both the original radical impulse and the later attempts at domestication. They leave us with questions rather than answers, with disquiet rather than certainty. And perhaps that is exactly what Romans should provoke. Not the sensation that we understand everything, but the awareness that there are layers of meaning that were lost, suppressed, or deliberately forgotten over time. The dark side of Romans lies not only in what the text says, but in what it represents. A worldview so radical that it needed to be constantly reinterpreted to become acceptable. A message so disturbing in its implications that it survived only through a continuous process of softening and domestication. Ancient manuscripts preserve traces of this original radicalism. They allow us to at least glimpse what may have been lost when Romans ceased to be a cry of despair and protest to become a text of systematic doctrine. And this leaves us with a final question that the records do not answer. Is it possible to recover this original force without falling into the extremes that led to its domestication? Or are some truths too radical to be lived integrally? The preserved manuscripts offer no answer. They merely document the tension and leave us to deal with it on our own. There is a question that the first 2 centuries of Christianity tried desperately to avoid. What happens when you take the implications of Romans to their final logical conclusions? The records that survived suggest that some communities did exactly that, and the result was so disturbing that a systematic machine of suppression was put in motion to erase not only their practices, but even the memory that they existed. In an abandoned monastery in Syria, archaeologists found in the last century a library hidden behind a false wall. Among the preserved manuscripts was a document that scholars reluctantly called the Confessions of Severinus, a first-person account of someone who participated in a 2nd century Christian community that interpreted Romans in an absolutely literal way. Severinus describes meetings where members publicly confessed not only their sins, but their fundamentally corrupted nature. They had concluded that if Paul was right about the human condition, then any attempt at personal reform was illusory. The only honest response was the complete recognition of one's own spiritual depravity. Notice the disturbing detail. These were not people distorting the text. They were applying with logical consistency the Pauline declaration that there's none righteous, no, not one. If this is literally true, then every pretension of spiritual growth, morality, or sanctification is self-deception. Severinus's manuscript describes rituals where participants publicly renounced any hope of personal improvement. They had developed a liturgy based on the perpetual confession of their own corruption. "We are spiritual dead," was the phrase they repeated, "and the dead do not become less dead with time." This leads us to an aspect of Romans that was completely excluded from later theological discussions. If human nature is truly spiritually dead, what exactly does it mean to be alive in Christ? Was Paul speaking of a real transformation, or merely a change of legal status? Fragments preserved in Koine Greek suggest that the first communities debated this question intensely. A papyrus found in Oxyrhynchus preserves part of a discussion where someone argues that the new life of Romans is only a divine declaration, not an experiential change. God calls us alive, says this text, but we continue feeling dead. This interpretation led some groups to radical conclusions. If spiritual transformation is only nominal, if the corrupted nature remains unaltered, then the only difference between Christians and non-Christians is the recognition of this condition, not its overcoming. Preserved manuscripts document communities that developed a theology of total transparency. They believed that the only honest response to the message of Romans was to stop pretending they were different from anyone else. No progressive sanctification, no spiritual growth, no victory over sin. A particularly disturbing fragment describes a practice called confession of futility. Members gathered to confess not only specific acts, but the uselessness of any effort for change. "I confess that my efforts to love are disguised selfishness," said one of the preserved formulas. "I confess that my prayer is spiritual manipulation." Think with me. This may sound like pathological exaggeration, but is it not merely the consistent application of Pauline anthropology? If there is none righteous, no, not one. If all human righteousness is as filthy rags, then would not any pretension of moral progress be self-deception? The problem is that this logic leads to a very dark place. Records indicate that these communities developed extreme forms of spiritual quietism. If nothing you do has a real moral value, why strive for anything? If your nature is fundamentally corrupted, why pretend otherwise? A Syriac manuscript preserves the account of a visitor shocked by one of these communities. "They do not pray, for they say their prayers are contaminated. They do not fast, for they claim their discipline is pride. They do not practice charity, for they allege their motives are impure. They only gather to confess their complete spiritual uselessness." This places us before an unsettling question. Had these people discovered an uncomfortable truth that later Christianity preferred to ignore? Or had they fallen into a distorted interpretation that Paul did not have in mind? What makes this question even more disturbing is that you can find textual support for both interpretations in Romans. When Paul says that "the good that I would I do not, but the evil which I would not that I do," he seems to be describing exactly the type of spiritual impotence that these communities embraced. Preserved manuscripts show that this tension was recognized from very early on. A letter attributed to Polycarp contains a specific warning against groups that make grace an excuse for spiritual laziness. He mentions people who use Paul to justify their refusal to seek holiness. But there is another side of the question that the records also document. Some of these quietist communities developed extraordinary forms of compassion. A preserved fragment describes how their renunciation of moral superiority made them uniquely capable of welcoming people rejected by other communities. They do not judge, writes a 3rd century observer, because they genuinely believe they are as corrupted as anyone else. Prostitutes, thieves, fugitive slaves, all find a place among them, not because they approve of these conditions, but because they do not consider themselves superior. Here is a fascinating paradox. The most pessimistic interpretation of Romans may have produced some of the most genuine manifestations of Christian love in ancient history. When you truly believe you are spiritually dead, you stop using religion as a tool of moral superiority. But this same interpretation also produced disturbing extremes. Preserved records document groups that took Pauline logic so far that they came close to what we would today call spiritual nihilism. If nothing you do has real value, if every human action is contaminated by corruption, then what is the point of anything? A manuscript found in a Coptic library preserves what seems to be an internal debate of one of these communities. Someone argues that if Paul is right about the human condition, then even the preaching of the gospel is a corrupted act, for it is performed by spiritually dead people. How can a dead man raise another dead man? Asks the text. How can a contaminated word communicate purity? If we are truly what Paul says we are, then our very existence contaminates everything we touch, including the message we carry. This question apparently led some groups to conclude that the only consistent response was complete silence. They stopped preaching, teaching, even speaking about spiritual matters. They had concluded that any human word about God would necessarily be a distortion. Preserved manuscripts suggest that these communities developed radical forms of apophatism, a negative theology where any positive affirmation about God or spiritual experience was seen as human contamination. They had concluded that the only honest theology was the recognition that we can know or say nothing about the divine without corrupting it. This leads us into territory that makes modern theologians deeply uncomfortable. Did Paul unintentionally open the door to forms of spiritual skepticism that undermined the very foundations of the Christian faith? Records indicate that ecclesiastical authorities recognized this danger very early. A document attributed to Ignatius of Antioch contains a specific refutation of groups that make humility a form of pride, the confession of sin a refusal of redemption. But the most disturbing thing is that these groups could cite Paul to defend every one of their positions. When questioned about their refusal to seek sanctification, they cited, "There is none righteous, no, not one." When confronted about their quietism, they pointed to the good that I would, I do not. When challenged about their negative theology, they cited how unsearchable are his judgments. Preserved fragments show that this created a hermeneutical crisis in the first Christian generations. How to interpret Paul in a way that preserves his radicalism without falling into the extremes that this radicalism seems logically to imply? The solution that emerged was a systematic reinterpretation that we today call doctrinal development. Later texts of the New Testament, especially the pastoral epistles, can be read as attempts to balance Paul's anthropological pessimism with the practical need to maintain functional communities, but there is evidence that this reinterpretation was not universally accepted. A papyrus found at Nag Hammadi preserves what seems to be a polemic against this domestication of original Paulinism. The author, identified only as the Solitary, argues that attempts to soften Paul represent a fundamental betrayal of his message. They transform the verdict into counseling, he writes, condemnation into guidance, despair into cheap hope. Paul preached death, they teach improvement. Paul announced spiritual bankruptcy, they offer moral reform. This type of criticism appears in various texts that were subsequently classified as heretical, a category that may have been used to suppress interpretations of Paul that were considered too dangerous to survive. The Gospel of Truth, another text from Nag Hammadi, contains passages that echo a radically pessimistic reading of Romans. Everyone walked in error, says the text, not knowing the Father. Error grew within them and made them fearful and troubled. This sounds very close to the Pauline description of the universal human condition. But there is a crucial difference. While Paul maintains the tension between despair and redemption, these later texts often resolve the tension by eliminating one of the poles. Some embrace pessimism completely. Others spiritualize salvation completely. Records suggest that it was exactly this polarization that led to the systematic suppression of extreme interpretations of Paul. Ecclesiastical authorities realized that certain readings of Romans were incompatible with the maintenance of viable Christian communities. A 4th century document preserved in Latin contains a list of forbidden interpretations of Pauline texts. Among them is the doctrine of total corruption that leads to spiritual inaction, and the denial of the possibility of moral progress that results in quietism. This places us before a historical irony. The same radicalism that made Paul powerful also made him dangerous. To preserve his influence, it was necessary to suppress some aspects of his original message. But perhaps the darkest aspect of this whole process is that it was never completed with total success. Throughout history, groups continued discovering and applying the most radical implications of Romans, usually with results that established authorities considered problematic. Manuscripts preserved from the medieval period document monastic communities that developed extreme forms of self-humiliation based on literal readings of Paul. They believed that any sense of spiritual progress was a dangerous illusion. Any satisfaction with their spiritual state was disguised pride. A 12th century text describes monks who refused to accept any praise for their piety, insisting that all apparent virtue was disguised internal contamination. They had developed a spiritual discipline based on the perpetual recognition of their own corruption. During the Reformation, some branches of Protestantism rediscovered dark aspects of Paul that had been suppressed for centuries. Calvin, for example, took the logic of total corruption to conclusions that many considered disturbing, including double predestination. But even Calvin recoiled before some implications of Pauline anthropology. Records show that he had to deal with followers who wanted to take his ideas even further, questioning the very possibility of certainty regarding individual salvation. This leads us to a question that traverses the entire history of Christianity. Is there any way to preserve Paul's radicalism without falling into the extremes that this radicalism seems to imply? Ancient manuscripts suggest that the first Christian generations did not find a satisfactory answer to this question. They document a constant tension between fidelity to the Pauline text and the need to maintain functional communities. This tension produced a peculiar form of theological schizophrenia. Paul was simultaneously venerated as supreme authority and systematically reinterpreted to neutralize his most disturbing implications. Christian communities learned to cite Paul while carefully avoiding the logical conclusions of his statements. Preserved fragments show that some realized this contradiction and considered it intellectually dishonest. A 3rd century text criticizes Christian leaders who honor Paul with their lips but deny his words with their practices. The author argues that true fidelity to Paul would require the type of radicalism that established communities were not willing to embrace. They want Paul's authority, he writes, but not his conclusions. This accusation raises questions that remain unanswered to this day. Did institutional Christianity represent a necessary betrayal of the original Pauline message? Or did it find a legitimate way to preserve its essence while avoiding its extremes? Ancient records do not offer a definitive answer, but they document the cost of this domestication, the loss of a dimension of radicalism that may have been essential to the original transformative force of the Christian message. And this leaves us with a final question that the preserved manuscripts do not resolve. What did we lose when we made Paul safe? What was the specific power of a message so radical that it needed to be constantly reinterpreted to survive? Perhaps the answer lies in the very fact that these questions continue to bother us. 2,000 years later, Romans still possesses the capacity to generate the type of intellectual and spiritual discomfort that its first audiences experienced. The dark side of the text has not disappeared completely. It has merely been pushed to the margins, where it continues waiting to be rediscovered by every generation that has the courage to read Paul without filters. Ancient manuscripts preserved not only the words, but also the disquiet they were capable of producing. They remind us that some truths are too disturbing to be completely domesticated, no matter how many centuries of reinterpretation are applied over them. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Romans a text that still deserves to be taken seriously. Its capacity to confront us with aspects of the human condition and spiritual experience that we would prefer not to examine too closely. The dark side is not a defect of the text. It is its most essential and transformative characteristic.